Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you might be. On behalf, my name is Aomar Boum. I'm professor of anthropology, history, and Near Eastern languages and cultures at UCLA, and Maurice Amado Chair in Sephardic Studies. On behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I would like to welcome you to today's virtual conversation with Dr. Yolande Cohen on Moroccan Jews' migration through France from camp to camp 1948-1956. This event is part of the Maurice Amado program in Sephardic Studies series. We would like to thank you for staying intellectually engaged by joining us for these virtual events. And I would like to extend my thanks to Chelsea and David for working on this program. Let me start by introducing our speaker. Dr. Yolande Cohen is a full professor of contemporary history at the Université du Québec, Montréal. Trained in social history and contemporary social movement, Dr. Yolande has focused her research on the processes by which groups traditionally excluded from political life have developed their participation in other forms of public practices. Dr. Cohen leads the research group on history, women, gender, and migrations. She has been a pioneer in the history of youth, women, and Moroccan Jews in France and Canada. She also worked on the mobilization of women in transnational movements in the first half of the 20th century, both in France and Canada. In her research on Moroccan Judaism, Dr. Cohen explores the migration of Moroccan Jews to France and Quebec, the process of immigration, the transfer of social networks, the establishment of the ethnoculture enclaves within larger cities, especially within Canada, political participation in the context of multiculturalism, and the transnational, what one can say or can label transnational Moroccan Judaism. In collaboration with other scholars in Israel, Canada, and France, Dr. Cohen produced a CD-ROM titled Moroccan Jews and worked on different topics, including producing a CD-ROM on Moroccan Jews through the ages, and published several works on Sephardic identities in Canada and France. As part of her migration research, she participates in the Concordia University project, Life Stories of Montreal Residents Displaced by War, Genocide, and Other Violations of Human Rights, collecting and analyzing life narratives of Sephardic migrants. In this conversation, we will explore with Dr. Cohen questions around her work on migration between Morocco, France, and Canada through her own personal experience. Professor Cohen's personal search for her birthday in Aubagne brought a discovery of dozens of transit camps in southern France. Searching in the French archives for the specific camps where she and her parents had spent a few years between 1948 and 1953, she came across thousands of names of Jews from North Africa that went through those camps, exiting Morocco, transiting in those camps in France before boarding ships to Haifa. Because this liminal moment in this migration is mostly ignored, Dr. Cohen will explore with us today here the clandestine and complex organization that brought the French administration to allow those camps to flourish in its periphery, in its southern periphery, in the aftermath of the Shoah and during Morocco's fight for independence from France. Dr. Cohen, welcome to this conversation. It's really a pleasure to have you, at least virtually, at UCLA, and I hope I'll be able to see you in the near future in Canada. You were born in France, before you returned to Meknes, where you grew up, before going back to France and then Canada. I want you to start by telling us not only your personal experience, but your memories of what Meknes looked like, quote unquote, as a little Jerusalem.
Thank you so much, Aomar, in having invited me to this talk. It's a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. It's really my vivid memories about being a young girl in Meknes have been all the time with me. And it's just a memory of that I'm very fond of since I grew up there, and I had my grandparents, I had my family, and for me, it stayed with me because it was just like something living in this extended family and being always with people, cousins, friends. This sense of community never left me. And I think when I try to remember my emotions, they're tied to this very close-knit community that I was part of. I didn't think much about it at that moment. But the thing that struck me the most when I revisit these moments is the sense of community and at the same time of being separate from them, because I was the oldest in my family, and coming back from France, my parents probably just had this idea that I should be raised in a French school. So contrary to my siblings who were younger, who went to Jewish schools and then eventually French schools, ever since I arrived in Meknes, I did everything in French. Like not the Alliance, but the French school for French. So all my friends were Catholic, French, and I felt very quickly this sense of alienation, because I was living in a Jewish, not the Jewish quarter, because we lived in the Ville Nouvelle already very quickly. I don't remember any souvenirs. We went back in Morocco 2 or 3 years ago, and I saw the small apartment my parents were living in the Nouveau Mela, the old quarters of the Jewish community. And I didn't have any souvenir of being there. But my souvenir started really when I was maybe 6 years old or 7 years old. And that was in the outskirts of Meknes, Ville Nouvelle, near the new area where Jews were allowed to stay, which was not the center of the Ville Nouvelle at that moment. It was 56, 57. And I was feeling estranged, really, from all my friends. My family was Jewish and my friends were French. So the souvenir that I kept was at the same time this very warm and very agreeable. No, I wouldn't say agreeable, because it was already very tense. The atmosphere in the community was very tense. Everybody was thinking of leaving. But it was warm. It was really always present. And on the other side, going to the lycée and going to the high school, to the college, I went to the lycée Paul Valéry. Mm-hmm. It was a total rupture. It was really completely different. So it was a sense of being divided, of being now I can say very quickly colonized, but the fact of being colonized is a very difficult you know, it's a very difficult thing to decipher when you're living in it.
It's
So
interesting. It's interesting how you take us from these different. Just for the listener, I think when you these spaces that you move, because we have the old Mellah of, or the Jewish quarter of Meknes, just right on the border of the what's now called the street of Meknes, or the avenue Meknes, and right on the wall, that the
exactly.
historical wall that surrounds the city. And then 1931, you have the French decide to establish the new Mellah, and then it was just on the other side of the street. And now
Exactly.
you and then you that within that new, close to that new Mellah, you got all what we call la rue des écoles, the streets of schools, where you have the Jewish schools, you have the French schools, and then around them you have the cemeteries. And now, but you're telling me that you've never had the chance to be within this space because your life was on the other side of the city, on the Ville Nouvelle, the French, the French district, or the French city, La Ville Nouvelle.
Yeah.
Which you're telling me that coming back from France, your life, as you felt that you're French, because that's a real and important point that I think I want to come back to. You felt that you speak, that you were born in France, you speak the language, and now this sense of closeness and detachment is it right to say that you're feeling this closeness to French and the detachment from France at the same time because of its rejection, but also closeness to Morocco because of the culture, or Meknes in particular, and somehow detachment from it because of your unfamiliarity with the place?
Exactly, exactly. So it's a very strange feeling of alienation that resulted in me being revolted against everything. So it was really very strange because I couldn't make a sense really of all this. At the same time, I had the impression that I could go from one place to the other with no problem. You know, we were talking with my friends on l'avenue principale de Ville Nouvelle, and we were reading Le Monde every day and commenting on Le Monde's stories. And when I was 15, 16, a little bit older. And at the same time, my friends became the ones that were living in the old Mela, well, the Nouveau Mela, rather than the old Mela. Old Mela, nobody was living there anymore in the 60s that I knew. I knew that my grandfather had a big place there, so I went there, but later I didn't know it when I was there.
As a
And
merchant or what? As a merchant or what?
he was a merchant, but he had his it's a fascinating story that I rediscovered because of studying, but
Mhm.
not because I was born there. I
Yeah.
mean, lived there. But it's a fascinating stories of 3 or 4 or 5 Jewish merchants that had built their own big houses in the 1920s. Like he bought it in 1924 and he rebuilt it and he redecorated it in a very beautiful fashion, etc. And so for him, he was an Arab Jew. You know, the definition of, he spoke Arabic, he was a judge for the Jewish tribunal, and he had his it was a tea and soap, little commerce just on the other side of the walls,
Mhm.
so not far from the old Mela. So everything, his life was really there, and he died in 48. I think he couldn't make it anything with the French. He didn't want to have anything to do with the French, whereas his younger brothers, who became the head of the community, Joseph Berdugo,
Yeah.
he became the head of the Meknes community for 30 years, and he was already in the Ville Nouvelle. So he was 5 years younger, maybe, or 6 years younger than my grandfather, but he immediately understood that he couldn't stay in the old Mela and built a beautiful Art Deco villa in the Ville Nouvelle, not far from where we were living, but we were renting a place where we didn't have that kind of money. So he was in the cereals. He was a merchant of cereals, Joseph Berdugo. So he was much more at ease and spoke French and had already the French habit. So I, for myself, didn't have all this. I was feeling that I was French, and that was it. French in Morocco, like my friends who were at school in the lycée and who thought of them, who were French, who were co-parent or, there for the French government. So it was very difficult for me when when I went to do the baccalaureate, that I didn't discover it. I knew I was Moroccan, but it was just like, oh my God, is this going to happen in the lycée? Because it was 68, the French had to go through a specific exam for the baccalaureate, which was just an oral. The Moroccan had another exam, and the Moroccan Jews had another exam in 68 in the French lycée. Then, the Moroccan Jew became a category for me to not to identify with, but that was imposed on me by the French administration, and which I resented very much. But that was it. It was true. It was true. I was a Moroccan Jew, but Moroccan first. So it was really a very interesting moment where I felt something was going wrong. Something was not really right.
Thanks. I think Meknes. I've always thought Meknes is really special, a unique city because of what you're highlighting here, the idea of the importance of French culture there, because Meknes itself was thought of as the new Paris of Morocco. It's an agricultural city. It's the development of agro-business, and all of these really things makes it. And also you have the
military,
center, the history
base, yeah,
the military base, and you have also the rabbinical courts and the Jewish courts, and it's a Jewish center that was the destination of all North African rabbis and North African students. So I think it's, and unfortunately, and that's why I think, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of research done on Meknes as a French city, quote unquote.
Right.
So I'm gonna now that we put our listener in this context, or at least we give our listener an idea of where you come from. I want to go back to two theoretical questions before I get back to the substance of the conversation. Is that there are two things that you're dealing with here. You're dealing with, I've read probably all, if not most, of your work on the Moroccan Jewish community in Canada, and I really think that in terms of your expertise, your work has really filled that major gap, and we're very grateful for all the research you've done on as far as that community, especially to people who work on this side of North America in the United States, who are trying to engage with questions of migration in the United States and Latin America. Your work is really very, very important for this conversation. So, but throughout your work, your personal story was never there. You can feel it, but it was not central. And then also the fact of going back to the origin and then tracing the stages of migration and focusing on the camp. So you're dealing with 2 points here. The idea of the personal, you're inserting your personal story into the research. Why now? What you're trying to get from it, what you're trying to drive from it. And then the question of these transit camps or these reception camps or whatever we're going to call them. The question of the camps also. Why these two different points as far as that you're trying to introduce to the bigger questions that you've already been dealing with for a long time?
It's a very important point that you raising. I think you had been producing extremely interesting work on the departure points in the rural areas of Morocco. And I, for my point of view, was always fascinated by the fact that this Jewish community in Montreal, where I landed eventually in '76, was so adamant about establishing itself as different from the Ashkenazi community. So I thought, most of them were my cousins, my friends, and they arrived here in the '60s. At the end of the '60s, they were young professionals. They left France, most of them. They studied in France, but decided to settle here. And I was really wondering, why would they so insist upon? So this identity of them is very strong. It's a really, not only as you mentioned, and as you had been outlining in your work, the religious aspect is quite important. And they were not Zionists. They didn't go to Israel. They came here in Montreal. So why did they leave? How did it? And none of them seemed to realize that it was a big leap. And the more I was interviewing them, and the less I understood why they left. Some said, oh, we had to study. Some say, oh, we left Morocco, we love Morocco, but we had to leave. Everybody was leaving, etc. So the why became something so difficult to answer that, of course, as all historians, we just say, okay, let's not ask why, let's just say how. Let's see how did it happen. And while we were studying the interviews and making the interviews, like it's a 30 years project, as you know, we had been working on that with my mother, with my daughter. It was really like a family project, but also with lots of students, and the research was funded, and it was, really, it became really a research project. And the more we were digging in that, and the more we saw how they transformed their identity from Moroccan Jew to Sephardic Jews, and Sephardic Jews to Sephardic diaspora, and then making adjustments like that in a Francophone area in Quebec, where they did well, considering, like now the Moroccan Muslims that are arriving in Canada have much more difficulties adapting to the Quebec society because of all kinds of hassles that the Jews didn't have in the '70s, because the society was more open, the Jewish community made everything to, but even if the Jewish community, mainly Ashkenazi, had done a lot, the Sephardi wanted to stay separate, had their own organization, etc. So there was some silence around the why. It was a very, very traumatic silence. So then, I thought maybe there is a trauma. So we had this interviews with the Montreal Life Stories, and we went through Holocaust survivors, and then when I interviewed them, most of them told me, but we are not refugees. Why are you including us into this whole story? We're not refugees. We are here because we wanted. So this agency of the migrant was really the thing that they put. And as you know, because that's your argument too, there is an agency in migration, for sure. For sure, there is. In those, and mostly because of those guys, they were French-speaking, they were educated. The one that came here, they were not the one that went to Israel, certainly not, Although in some family reunion, many went through Israel and then came to Montreal. So it's not, of course, it's not you know, it's a circulation of those people. They circulate through diaspora places. So why insert my own story? I think my own story was always inserted into it, but I think I am now only now allowing myself, because also the research area has changed a lot, and we can put our subjectivity in front and say, look, this is where I am talking from. This is my point of view. Then it became very, very important for me to see where I was born. And the fact that I discovered very late, like 5 years or 6 years ago, not that I didn't know where I was born. Sure, I knew I had to always provide this stupid certificate that was in Aubagne that I had to ask for each time in Aubagne where I never went, etc. But it was some kind of this really a big silence around the Aubagne camp. It was not called the camp. The best that it was called in my family was Arshara. My father was talking about Arshara, but Arshara didn't mean anything to me. There was no works on, you know, yes, the Israeli historians know about Arshara and had been trying to see if they had archives, etc. No archives on their family, on the people that didn't leave to go to Israel. So I had to go to Aubagne. It took me a very strong energy. It took my children and my husband to come with me. We were 8 of us to go back to this camp. Of course, I had done previous work to find out where it was, and even that, the previous work, because I went and copied the archives, I couldn't open them. So it was a real traumatic moment for me to come back to the fact that I was born in a refugee camp. Right. And I couldn't make myself really, and even in the last conference we did last year, I couldn't get myself into saying that. So it took me.
Sorry to interrupt you here, but
yes, sure.
It's really important. I want to go back to a word you use, which I think theoretically, and then before we get back to talk about the camps and the description of these camps and how they're connected, but you use a word that's, I thought it's a really powerful word that called floating. The idea of floating between different worlds. And I think it makes sense to use it and link it to the personal to talk about this general context. So is the floating about identity, cultural identity, or is it about being itself, the question of being as a person, trying to figure out which space you belong to? Is it Quebec? Is it Meknes? Is it some parts in France, or is it some part in the Holy Land, and so on and so forth? What is this floating about?
Yeah, well, 40 years of analysis later, I think the floating is really a diasporic floating. It's a space floating between spaces. And then about the being, I think it's probably a very important aspect of not finding your place as an immigrant. And it took me long time to decide that I was a Montreal Jew, you know, whatever that means, that I'm living in Montreal and that I am now here. And this is it. Floating, I had been floating a long time between those places. I went back to Morocco, I don't know how many times, I can't even count. Went back to France how many times. So between those places, I had been floating, yes, but working also. but my identity eventually started to stabilize. But I'm older, much older. So it took me a long time to stop the floating, because a long time and lots of work. And I think one of the biggest problems as immigrants, well, maybe I'm not going to generalize that much, but as Jewish Moroccan immigrants, I must say, just not to generalize too much in Montreal, that's probably the biggest challenge we're facing. My generation, who had been emigrating, and maybe also for our kids' generation. My kids think they're born here, but they think of themselves of being Moroccan as well. So they go very often to Morocco, and they have friends, and they cook Moroccan food, and they do Moroccan traditions. So it's identity that is strong. The Jewish Moroccan identity is a very strong one. It has lots of different roots, but at the same time, I think this floating still exists for most of the people here. And that explains a lot of those migrations. For instance, the French, the Moroccan Jews in France move from Morocco to France, then France, Israel, and then Israel, France, emigrate, come back, they come here in Montreal. It's a circulation that is really, really a very, it's not a happy one. It's a difficult one.
So thank you. So because I think you're right. I feel it. I feel it in the research you've done, in the interviews you've done, especially with women, and you can see that really the gender part is really an important part, and I think that's also another really powerful dimension of the work you've done in Canada. But let's go back now to the camps, and if you allow, if you don't mind, can you describe to us these camps that we've worked on? Sarastan and I, in some of the work we've done in Morocco and in North Africa in general, you're talking about camps right after World War II. We've done, the interesting part is that the camps we worked on, those are camps where you have only European Jews, you don't have Moroccans, or you don't have North Africans in general. But now you're talking about a different situation where post-World War II, in a process of migration of Moroccan Jews and North African Jews to outside of North Africa, you're talking about in transit, these people find themselves living in conditions of transit camps or reception camps or whatever you're going to call it. So can you tell us a little bit about what these camps look like, what's like there, and what kind of conditions, and for how long they were established?
You know, those questions are still in the making. We don't have answers to all those questions. The startling thing was that we discovered those camps just randomly. Not random for me because I was looking for a specific camp, but randomly in the archives. They were not even indicated. We had to go through really troves of archives of the Ministry of Interior to find out that they existed. So we mapped out 50 or more of those camps. And as you said, there was a small camp, Kadima, near Casablanca before, and they were also a transit route going through Algiers. But mainly, those routes were going from Casablanca, Algiers to Marseille. Marseille was the biggest hub. So those camps were transformed from DP camps to North African Jews camps. It's very interesting that nobody, even the specialist, Péchanski of the camps in France, never heard about those camps. He never even thought that the Arenas camp, which is one of the biggest camp of all, was transformed into a transit camp until the 1960s. So they rebuilt the Arenas camp, and it was there as much as we have found traces for that. that they were proceeded, and it was the hub, the main hub. They were transported from by bus or train from the different villages and places where they were driven by Mossad agents or Jewish agency agents in Morocco. So they were gathered starting 1946 onward. You have those transit camps that were set up around the Marseille area. And it was a very strange arrangement, a very complex arrangement between the Zionist organization, the Fédération des Sociétés Juives de France, which was a French Jewish organization, with Frédéric Taux in Marseille, who were dealing with really receiving all those refugees. And then in the in 1950, because the flow was even bigger, they opened training centers. So the difference between those training centers, camps, children's home, care centers are difficult to establish really, but they were classified by the French administrative people like that. So the training center, so the camps were maybe 15 or 20 in the Marseille region area, and another 20 training center, which were called by the Israeli Arsharot, or farm schools, and were intended in the papers we found to train diaspora youth in agricultural work and to prepare them for communal life in the kibbutz. And they belonged, but we don't know how much they belonged to the organization that were named by the inspectors writing those reports, to the Chalutz, a pioneer movement, and were intended for the people aged 16 to 18 years old. So they were Zionist youth movement of the Chalut. They were religious centers of the Bahad, Alliance of Religious Pioneers, and they were organized by the Jewish Agency with the support of the World Art Organization and the financial commitment of the American Jewish Joint Committee. Some of the others were socialist or conservative Zionist movements. So you had really the sense that they had the idea of instilling Zionist values and spirits of the new Jewish man. And there is this new thesis of Chaim Biton in Israel that had been going through these camps as well in Morocco, essentially. And he shows that those camps were really the first encounter of those people with the Zionist Israeli state. Of course, as you know, and as you very well shown, as you've shown already in your work, Zionist movement were in Morocco since the 1900s, and it was very active. And I like the difference you do following Zur's analysis between modern and traditional Zionist ideology. And I would say that it was those camps, in a way, it was part 3 of the Zionist installment in Jewish Morocco, really. It was the final moment of departure that was organized by Zionists from A to Z to bring those people to Israel. But in fact, most of them, to answer the rest of the question, most of those people, and the list of the names, it was really staggering to me. It was really like, how the French administration is really very precise and wants to identify everybody that comes into its territory. Well, the names, the numbers, it was really staggering to see people from in Meknes, for instance, going, the whole families going through those camps. So actually, there are really two different part into this, the families and the children or youth, because of course the ages, well, it's a very touchy thing. Some were 13, some were 14. Did they have the authorization of their parents? How did they live? So we have some stories that we gathered where the parents say, yes, the agent came to my house and they said that could I take your daughter or your son, and we'll train them before going to Israel, but then you don't have to give an authorization for Israel. We just have to bring them in France. So it's a very big story that we don't know much about. How were they treated, how they were organized. My parents, for instance, they stayed in this camp for 4 years. Some others, I interviewed a person, and her father became, because he was there, and the Jewish agency needed people that spoke French or Arabic. So he was hired by the agency, and they stayed. They never left to go to Israel. And she's living in Marseille now, and she just remembers this moment as a small, interlude in her life. But her father worked for the Jewish agency for 40 years. So it's very difficult to know. We have police intervening, for instance, in the Arenas camp to fight because there were people fighting. My father had different memories. So this is really a big story, and one that comes back to the question that you were raising in your works, which is how much the Zionist organization was involved in the dispersion and the exile or the transportation. We know now that they were very much involved. They were really, I mean, in those villages and in all those places. Yaron Sur and you had been working on those villages, but now we almost have, when they arrive in those camps, we know how many they were. And we have just to go through counting and through all the troves of archives. And my student, Emilien Tortel, is doing his PhD thesis on how many and how much, and going through these archives to find out more about those camps. But one fact is sure now, I think, that we can answer the question that you and me were raising about the implication of the Zionist movement and organizations, the many organizations around it in Morocco. And we can say with certainty that they were very, very much involved.
So I've got two more questions left. And so one takes us back to Meknes, and one takes us more from Meknes to Canada. So you have, by the way, you have no idea how much your work has influenced the work I'm doing in LA now on Moroccan Jews in LA, because I think, and these connections that you're making as you're floating, you're anchoring also, and then you're setting all these links. So what made your family decide after 4 years to go from the camp in France to Meknes? And what does going back tell us about this also circulation of people who come? This is where I think you mentioned the question of agency. Some people with migration is also in some parts about agency. People go, make decisions, they find the environment is not there, they change their decisions. So what makes your family go back? And then I will have a couple of questions about your work on Canada, because I think it still remains the anchor of this floating that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a very important question. I had been asking them that for a long, long time. And of course, obviously, it's a difficult question for them to answer because in a way, they were they were taken. I have to come back to a little bit of the family history.
Yeah.
My father's family left, they were 10 children, and if I remember well, 6 of them decided to leave because the father, my grandfather, my father's father, was a Zionist. He was really a messianic Zionist, as we could define him. He wanted to leave Morocco in the 1920s and 30s. We have letters from him to the British government asking for a visa. He didn't get the visa. He died eventually in 43. And then they left. The older brother of my father and sisters, they all left when they could in 48. So they were Zionists. But when they arrived in Israel in 48, it seems that I had been interviewing my aunts who were very young when they arrived in Israel. They were 15 and 17 and resented very much the fact that they were brought to Israel without their consent by their brother. So that's what they said. That's what they told me. And then they said, we were waiting for your father to come and he couldn't come, but they knew that it was not going well. And we have letters, people had been now studying the letters from the soldiers of Morocco, sending to Moroccan family. They were not fine. They lost everything they had with them in 48. And even my uncle, he established the first North African organization in Israel, in Haifa, asking Ben Gurion for his recognition of the Moroccan because they felt discriminated against. So the story in my family was that my 2 brothers of my father came back to Morocco from Israel in 52.
Yeah.
So they and my father was stranded there in Marseille, and everybody was telling him, what are you doing in Marseille? Go to Israel or come back. My mother's family was all staying there, the Berdugo. They were very well settled in Meknes. They didn't want to have anything to do with going. My grandmother would have gone, but her children were there, so they wouldn't move. So eventually, after a while, it seems that they made a lot of pressure on my father's and mother to come back to Morocco, where they just settled back in Meknes with their whole family. So that says a lot, of course, about this agency that we were talking about, but also, you know, the agency within the constraint of the possibilities that were open. They didn't have papers in France. They were still on visa that were, and I was born there, but they never thought that they should declare me as a French citizen. I never became a French citizen. So they had no clue of what to do. So they were caught into this Jewish enclave in Marseille with no more. At one point, my father was telling me, oh, yeah, we tried to settle in Marseille at one point because I wanted to do some business. They didn't have any papers. It was very difficult. So they didn't have probably any kind of possibility in staying in Marseille. So they went back to Morocco. So, and we have proofs now from letters that, and I think Avi Picard has been also documenting lots of people that had arrived from Morocco to the Ma'abarot that had been settled in the outskirts of Israel, wanted to go back, but they couldn't because they had to repay the Jewish agency. So there was this circulation that could have been going on a lot more if they were able to do it. So that's my answer from the personal.
Thank you. So I have a couple of more questions. I want to now, we're going to travel back or travel to Canada and highlight. I want to ask you about 2 questions. I think you already do a good job setting up these questions in your answer to why the family went back to Meknes. And one of them is this idea, use the word enclave, but also use the word language, French. I think I see it even here in LA. French, I think is really an important element as far as how the community set up itself in Canada. And then you have a very successful, I would say, from my understanding of your work and the communities, very successful Moroccan Jewish community in Canada. And probably because and you've done a lot of work, so I want you to explain to our listener how did this community was able to set up in Canada instead of, at least in the 50s and in the 60s and 70s in Canada, instead of the United States. So language, we said, is an important part, but there has to be something in addition to language. And you use the word enclave. Once you talk about the enclave, you talk about, I would say, an independent community that's culturally independent, linguistically independent, financially, all of the element that would make it a very successful community that still can be part of the larger Quebec area, but it was also, it has all the element, the cultural, the political, the social, the economic element to make it somehow live on its own to some extent. So if you can talk about these two questions or these two elements here.
Yes, yes. The Moroccan Jewish community arrived here, and they were mostly, as I told you, young professionals. And in a study we did, it was really quite interesting to see that most of them arrived as single men. They were not more men than women, but the single men married with French Catholic girls. In my study, we studied the synagogue Spanish and Portuguese, where they first arrived in the 70s, end of the 60s. It was a third of them. It's a lot. It's a lot. So, and that's just one part, because those are the ones that asked for conversion of their girlfriends, so you have all the rest that didn't convert, that just went through. So they came here and they were ready really to be totally included within the French Québécois society. And because of the very multicultural, it's the years that the Canada becomes a multiculturalist state in the 72. That means that if you are creating your own organization, you're going to have subsidies from the government. You can keep your language, and so most of the as we call them at that moment, ethno-cultural communities became, stronger, more organized, because they had the means to do it, and they were encouraged also culturally and politically to do so. But in the meantime, so you had these federal policies from the Canadian government that was encouraging you to be your own identity. So as a Jew and as a Sepharad, that's when they started becoming Sephardi. And then at the same time, in the 70s, you have the revolution, or the rest of the Revolution Tranquille, which affirms the importance and of the majority of French-speaking Québécois. The French Canadian became Québécois, asserting their identity not through religion, when that was the case before, as was the case before the Revolution Tranquille, but through the language. And that was decisive. And the language, the French language, became the cement where you could become a Québécois. So arriving here, this small group of people decides very quickly to become a member of the majority, the French-speaking majority, which means that they're not included in the Anglophone Jewish community, and that they can, because of this multiculturalist story, they can assert themselves in the separate organization, Jewish organization. And I must say, it became a very difficult thing within the Jewish community, which saw this separation as something that was some kind of non-confidence affirmation, even though, of course, everybody was saying, no, we're part of the bigger Jewish community. But for a while, it was really, really a divisive question to have those two branches of the Jewish community until when everybody thought that Quebec was becoming really French. Even the English-speaking Jewish community understood that it was interesting to have the Sephardic community included within the majority. Not that all this was really spoken exactly like this, but that's my interpretation. So in a way, they arrived in a moment of a very big expansion of Quebec, the affirmation of Quebec as a Francophone majority. So they got jobs because of their formation. And for the women, they really, most of the women that arrived that were, you know, with some expertise, they could very quickly transform this expertise into work and money. Mm-hmm. So that means money for their jobs, of course, travail salarié, you know, for a job that would be something important for them. So immediately there was this feeling that they could do well. Most of the teachers, for instance, that came they founded the École Maïmonide, which is probably the only Jewish school in North America in French. And it's a very successful Jewish school. They quickly succeeded into getting their permit from the Quebec government, and became integrated as a private Jewish French school, but in the Francophone curriculum. So it was a very, very quick, and if we compare to the other people that arrived in the same moment, theirs, like for instance, the Chilean community or even the Portuguese community that arrived around the same moment, they were much more quickly integrated economically, as would say, integrated into the French Quebec society. Culturally and politically, this is another story. And that is probably related much more to their identity, you know, the search of their identity that we were talking about earlier.
So before I conclude, I want to ask you one last short, one question that you can answer in a short way if you wish. There is a movement now, a scholarly movement, an academic movement of research on Moroccan and North African Jews in general in the Americas. And I think overall, a lot of these research trends have to go through Canada. That's my, at least in terms of the Moroccan Jewish community, they have to go through Canada. If you look at the majority of Moroccan Jews who are in the West Coast, at some point they had to go through Montreal or some other place. Not, some of them do go through New York, but so Canada becomes, I think it's a central node in this research. Yeah. So what kind of, how do you see the future of research in, as far as the Jews of the region, and I would say in general North African Jews, in the Americas, including South America? And what kind of advice you would give to, as far as the lapses and the silences that are missing in the research, what kind of advice you would give to future generation of researchers?
Well, it's a very complex question because this research had been going on because or thanks to the scope that has been centered on colonized and post-colonized groups. And the Moroccan Jews or North African Jews are really in a very interesting position. I think they gather lots of interesting points that could be that could highlight the questions that we are raising now in this line of inquiry. And it has to be, I think, transnational. We called it earlier diasporic, but I think transnational networks, and it has to be also worked with towards those post-colonial migrations and the history, and their history is really interestingly has to be linked with each other. I think right now, this discussion that we're having is really an important one, I think, because it just brings up several links, like your link coming from rural areas, the links with Zionism, the link with the French colony. It's really a very important how the French had been this empire, and that comes down all the way to Quebec, because Quebec wouldn't have been at all an idea to immigrate to if it was not for France. So they didn't go to France, but they went to another French-speaking country. So I think this whole thing is really a very important thing to do. And for North American stories linked to South America. For instance, as you know, all the people that were living in northern Morocco that were under Spanish rule and Portuguese rule, they all went to Venezuela, Argentina. And so, yeah, it has to be linked.
Brazil. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
It's really, it's been a pleasure to have the conversation with you and to.
Likewise.
I know you've been at some point here in LA, but we'll probably hope to have you in person here at some point in the future.
Thank you. And to have you in Montreal, you have to come. Well, I'll make sure we'll invite you here because it's a long due. Thank you so much, Aomar. And thank